on it.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you. So I like it to be as transparent and also as interactive as possible in this conversation. So while I may be presenting some content, if you have any questions, feel free to just raise your hands. For those of you that have your video on, I can see you raising your hands, or you can do it electronically through the Zoom. If you're not too sure about something, just kind of, do your hands like this to say, slow down or ask another question. Feel free to let me know. Okay. So just so that want to make sure everybody's okay, we're going to record this. There's a lot of people that can't attend a specific time, and they've specifically said, can you record it so we can share it and learn about it later on? So you guys okay with this? Can you give me a thumbs up? Yep. And since I can't see you, can you give me a thumbs up on the reaction time, on the reaction feature, please?
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So let's start with a basic ground rule for conversations. So this is what's called above and below the line, right? So above the line, you have ownership, accountability, responsibility, and then below the line, you have blame, excuses, denial. So part of our conversation will always stay above the line and looking at solutions to how to resolve issues rather than blame other people or make excuses or have any kind of denial, staying in the victim mentality. Okay, so just a very simple, straightforward ground rule that we want to all stay above the line in this conversation. Okay, everybody okay with that? Yes, okay. All right, so we already talked about a little bit about this, what you like to get out of the workshop. Specifically, we're going to talk a little bit more of a focus looking at the K through 12 aspects. Looks like 2 more people just joined. Let's give them a quick chance to say hello. Hi, Hannah. And Alexis.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good timing. We're just getting started. So we're doing a couple of warm-ups on the conversation just to get your perspective as what would you like to get out of this workshop, and then anything specific about CRT that you'd like to talk about. So I make sure we cover those topics.
Thanks.
Anything specific you'd like to get out of this, Alexis?
Yeah, I would like to have some deeper understanding about how CRT could be or couldn't be used, introduced in our high school learning. Why and why not?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Hannah, any other thoughts that you'd like to share? Alexis, you're actually off the hook. I said Hannah.
Oh, okay.
Hannah, can you hear me? Okay. Well, let's go ahead and move on then. Hannah, feel free to ask any questions. If you have a question, you can just use the, since I can't see you on the screen, feel free to use the notation for the, kind of raising your hand or clap or whatever notation you have on your Zoom. All right, so let's start with setting the stage for a better understanding of this, okay? I want to start with the concept of content versus context. Okay? Content is what we teach, okay? So it's the actual theory of it. It is the content of what we do. So everybody has a job, for example, right? What we do in our jobs is, manage a project, deliver a lesson, right? Whatever that job is, that's the content. The context is how we go about doing it, okay? So for example, in the contextual world, every single adult has some type of annual training within their organizations, right? Everybody does some type of annual ethics training, annual sexual harassment, or these days you have diversity training. The context of that is a conformity model that leaders say, hey, you have to do this. And at the end outcome, people with certificates on these annual trainings often don't remember exactly what they're supposed to have learned in the first place. So it really makes very little impact, especially when these annual training models are not implemented into the organizational policies, structures, or systems, right? So in the context of the adult annual training system, it's not very effective for any kind of major adult learning that changes how people think and how people behave. Okay? When we look at the student K through 12, one of the biggest challenges in K through 12 is the amount of recall. Most people tend to learn a lot of content being pushed at them, whether it's history, math, science, and so on. But the context of that has a huge challenge in how much do our students really remember, right? You're all familiar with the show, Are You Smarter Than the Fifth Grader, right? Every single time, adults have a tough challenge beating the kids and remembering all these facts and things that they should have learned and ideally remembered. So the context of a lot of the education is how much do we really remember, right? So again, content is what we teach, context is how we teach it and how much people remember. Okay, so I'm going to use those language as a framework for talking about CRT later on as we move forward. Okay, so there's a huge element in the content of the CRT aspect and the theory from an academic perspective, as well as how it's being used as a weapon, as a training model, as somebody suggesting introducing it in the K-12 education. It's how it's done. All right, so we're going to look at both sides of it so we can look at the critical aspects. Now, before moving forward, we want to get a good understanding of what is a system. Okay, one of the key aspects for CRT, it is a systemic analysis tool to understand the system in the legal law from a historical perspective, right? So what is a system? So when we look at the education system as a whole from a historical perspective, before the Industrial Revolution, every aspect of the education system that we currently know did not exist. Everybody was on an apprenticeship model. We were learning their specific trades, whether you're a blacksmith or you're a printer or you're a farmer. Everybody learned from someone. It was a one-on-one apprenticeship model of education. Industrial Revolution happened, and then the capitalists, those that try to manage the big factories, said, oh, we need a system to manage employees. So the education system was created based on that premise of let's manufacture as many employees as possible in the masses so that we can control them within the assembly line system, right? Because at that point, labor was the major resource that everybody was hired for to work on an assembly line. So the context of conformity was a major part of the education system. Okay, now moving forward to today times, how much has that changed? We've updated our curriculum quite a bit with a lot of new technologies, new thought, new theories, and then CRT is just another one of those new theories that's come about into our awareness. But when we look at the development of our critical thinking, how much our teachers and our education system is developing critical thinking? Okay, so for example, I always, especially with Todd teaching leadership in this group here, I always have fun with a lot of people teaching leadership is how much do you let your students disagree with you? How are you using what you're teaching in the classrooms on top of teaching the theories and studies and everything that's happening? How we engage in the critical thinking so that people are not afraid of the authority figure, right? Whether it's in the classroom or in the workplace or wherever we're at. So the development of critical thinking is a huge element here in all of our K-12 as well as our higher education piece. Okay. Even more importantly, moving forward, development of systems thinking, understanding a system, right? I see so many people currently getting very high paying jobs as chief diversity officers in this DEI movement, getting a lot of money, but yet they're not necessarily able to make a difference between, hold on a second, so a few people join here. Okay. Welcome to the guys, everybody that just joined. We're just getting started. So feel free to let me know if you have any questions as we move forward. We're just finishing talking about what is a system and then the difference between content and context. Okay. So quick review, content is what we teach. Context is how we teach, right? So finishing up our conversation here about the history of education as a system is a lot of the education system, when it was initially built, was built for the Industrial Revolution, for manufacturing as many employees as possible for the labor workforce. In the current environment, all of this is really focused on how are we developing critical thinking, how are we developing systems thinking so that our graduates leave with the ability to make conscious decisions. Okay, now content. Let's talk about CRT from a content perspective, okay? So origins of CRT started more than 40 years ago. Initially, it was a conversation, a critical look at the intersection between race and US law and policy, okay? How do these two play out, right? So one of the basic studies that was done in validating theory was done in 1930, where they looked at how lawmakers drew lines around financially risk people and then literally drew lines on a map, okay, that they did determine as financial high risks. So as a result, banks would never give mortgages to these people in the group, right? Now, that particular example was a lot of African-American people inside those borders of those lines, okay? That's one example of CRT. And the way they started looking at it is, how are people being judged? How are people being qualified into a specific group rather than looking at individual differences? Okay. So when we look at the current environment, there's a lot of further studies out, what is exactly happening here? So one of the other studies looked at amount of textbooks that's given to K-12 education, right? And one study found nearly 40% are written in such a way that is totally culturally unconscious, okay? It has no concept of any culture, any diversity inside of them. And a lot of this is because the people that are writing the books, the companies that are doing this, they hire people that are not necessarily conscious of cultural identity, conscious of different challenges that are happening. So they simply write their books based on their view of the world, right? Which is what's been taught to them. So it's a one after another moving forward in those directions, okay? So when we look at the text, 40% of the text is culturally unconscious, right? So that's the academic side of things, okay? There's various aspects of history, there's various aspects of the legal system that are very limiting to certain groups of minorities based on whatever category you want to look at, whether it's financial and so forth, okay? Now, one of the key aspects to look at critical race theory is it is a tool to teach critical thinking and systems thinking. It is a tool, okay? That's what critical race theory is about. It's simply a tool. Now, unfortunately, the amount of usage is quite interesting, okay? Because we live in a capitalistic society, people see something and they want to make money with it, okay? So they create chaos, they create whatever issues that may happen. When you look at the first item here, the desire to create a fair, equitable system is one outcome in systems thinking, okay? The other side, fighting against oppression, right? In many situations, when we fight against oppression, we fight against something in a fight, somebody wins, somebody loses, right? But at the end, do we really win? Okay, in a battle, it's hard. Now, from a systems thinking perspective, if we were solely staying on the systems thinking side as CRT as a tool to look at systems thinking, how are we creating a fair, equitable systems, right? That's the challenge that we can throw out to various policymakers, various people that are having this conversation. The negative side of this is a lot of times it's being used as a weapon, okay? I've seen various articles and various pieces, and even to the extortion side, basically saying, well, you're white and you're a racist, right? And I've seen letters where even certain people are using the historical challenges from the forefathers to very wealthy neighborhoods saying, pay us money because your forefathers wronged us, okay? And it's fascinating to see the negative dynamics of that. Now, one of the major challenges in the application of critical race theory is the duality. You're either the oppressed or you're the oppressor, okay? It's one of these two groups, right? And within the duality system, it's either wrong or right, which gets people to fight. And in our society, there's so much fighting going on about CRT. And rather than looking at the educational aspect of it or the creating equitable systems to move us forward as a species, as opposed to sit back and fight, which is part of our political system as well. So there's a lot of other interesting applications to CRT, which is what makes this very, very muddy in everything that we're talking about, okay? And then, of course, the mental crutch. The mental crutch is basically people using their race, their color, their gender, whatever it is, as a crutch to get ahead, right? So if I am of this color, species, or whatever it is, I get a special card that says I can do something wrong, but then you can't fault me for it, or I should get hired because of certain characteristics, right? That's the mental crutch that some people tend to use it as. And I've seen this played out in so many different companies recently that it's really sad to see what it's doing to our economy and to a lot of our companies, right? For one very basic example, a major manufacturing company here in Columbus, Ohio, okay? July 4th comes up, demand always increases because of July 4th weekend. They were a beverage company, right? So the management said, hey, everybody needs to work an extra shift on Saturday. This has been done over and over again for every single holiday in the history of this company, okay? One small specific group said, well, no, we're not working because, you're discriminating against us because we're Black. Management said, oh, okay, then they back down, right? Guess what happens after that? Everybody shows up on Saturday except this one small group. Now there's tension between companies, employees fighting against each other. And there's tension with management on top of that, on both sides, right? So the kind of turmoil that it's creating and using it as a specific mental crutch is starting to hurt our economy. And I can give you endless amount of examples of what we see in companies right now that are people doing obviously things that are not necessarily correct, but they're using this as a race card, or they're playing their card to make sure that they get away with whatever they want to get away with. Okay, that's the challenge application side of things. Okay, so we're going to look at CRT from a perspective of how do we create the equitable systems in our society so that we move forward as a species moving forward rather than get too busy fighting. Okay, all right. So one major consideration I like everybody here to look at: the actions of one does not reflect the whole. Okay. One of the major challenges within critical race theory is categorizing people into a group. Well, if you're this color, you're this race, you're that, you get categorized into a group of being good and bad. We've seen this many times with a lot of the movements that we currently have. Everybody's categorizing one person's action towards an entire group, which exactly what goes against every aspect of what diversity, equity, inclusion should be about, right? Okay, so I'm gonna stop here for a second. See if there's any questions or anything so far on the content of critical race theory and how it's being applied currently. No questions? Okay. All right. So continuing on. Now, one of the challenges with critical race theory a lot of times in the current environment is I see the misinformation that's being pushed and putting critical race theory together with some of these other concepts. Okay, so I want to make sure there's some clarification between it. Okay, so diversity, equity, inclusion, a major movement that looks at systemic racism, looks at social justice. Critical race theory and diversity, equity, inclusion is not the same. Critical race theory is one small element of how diversity, equity, inclusion can be played out. But diversity, equity, inclusion really focuses on the value of the individual thought within the diversity aspect, the diversity of thought that moves people forward, that creates innovations for companies, okay? Equity looks at how can we make sure that every single individual has their own chance to succeed no matter where they're at. So if they have certain challenges or weaknesses or whatever that is, those things are encountered or addressed from a development perspective, right? Inclusion is even more clear sometimes, but I see a lot of even groups that are diversity groups don't really use inclusion in certain ways, because inclusion basically states, if I want to make a decision that includes you, I should involve you, right? So if we're in a meeting in a company, you have meeting agendas. Are they including you on creating the meeting agenda, right? There's different ways to go about doing that. So that's what diversity, equity, inclusion is. So this is a huge movement with many, many different dimensions of it. CRT is one very small aspect, right? And looking at it from a K through 12 perspective, diversity, equity, inclusion can be used in many different aspects of education, right? How included are the students in the education process, for example, right? How each individual student can get what they need in order to be successful in the equity side of it, right? So all these are very different concepts from CRT. CRT is very separate. It's one small aspect of DE&I, okay? All right. Social emotional learning is another one that seems to get confused. Social emotional learning specifically looks at the self-awareness, the self-control, and also how students can emotionally cope with various situations. So like the pandemic, for example, right? We have so many students right now dealing with depression issues and mental anxiety and a lot of mental health issues. That's what social emotional learning is really all about, helping the students get better tools to be able to cope, to be able to thrive in all these challenging times when their mental anchors, things that they're normally used to, are being ripped out right from underneath them and they don't really understand why, okay? That's what social emotional learning is really about. So it's very different from CRT, okay? Systemic racism is another piece that often gets talked about. And I find it quite fascinating for a lot of the people that are like chief diversity officers in major companies, getting paid up to $500,000 a year, right? Major players in this game, they don't know what a system is, okay? When we look at systemic racism, the systemic racism is not about a certain people or a group of people. It's the system, right? So when you look at Dublin City Schools, one of the major challenges that Dublin City Schools have is how many of percentage of the students are identified as gifted students when you compare the white population versus the black population, right? What is the difference between the two? It is a drastic difference between the two. So this is a systemic issue and a systemic outcome, not saying one group is bad or another group is bad, but we look at the system as how it's perpetuating. Okay, that's what systemic racism is. It is not about a certain group of people trying to do this. Most people play the game that's already set up for them. Okay, all right. So the final thing, critical race theory sometimes gets confused with critical thinking. Critical thinking is everybody's ability to look at information and dissect it and say, okay, this is truth, this is not true. This is political agenda, this is some type of misinformation, whatever that is. And when I talk to people on both sides of this battle currently, it's fascinating for me to see that they're digesting a lot of the misinformation as truth and not looking at who is it coming from, what's their agenda, what's their educational background, what's the research basis for everything they're saying. None of those questions get asked. They simply take that information from wherever and say, okay, that's the truth, therefore I'm going to fight that battle for them, right? So there's so much challenges in critical thinking that's going on that we need to further develop, especially in our children, to get a better understanding of what reality is and how do they process their own identities moving forward. Okay. So these are 4 different commonalities that people sometimes get CRT confused with all this. Okay. All right, so any questions on these topics? We can probably go into any one of these. The diversity, equity, inclusion one, we did a whole seminar talk on it a couple of weeks ago. I can be happy to send you the video if you wanted to see that one. But these are complex topics that we can address more later on. Okay. So any questions on anything so far?
Hello.
Yes, go ahead. Yes, Alexis.
Systemic racism. So I wanted to make sure I understand you correctly. Did you mention that the disparity or the huge gap between or among different races in the percentage for the percentage of student identified as the gifted in DCS is a reflection of systemic racism?
Yeah, it's one outcome of systemic racism.
It's one outcome of that. Yes. So so if you do you want to talk about more details about this? If you want to say this is one outcome of it, do you think this is like 100% structuralism, like a kind of outcome, or it's the most important contributor, or it's one of the elements that led to this outcome?
Yeah. So when we look at a system, there's no such thing as one contributor, right? So in social science, we never look at cause and effect. It's too simple. Like in physical science, we can say, okay, a ball drops, the gravity pulls it down, and how many seconds the ball fall, right? In social science, it's always people relating to each other. And there's so many influences to how a human brain works and how a human brain thinks, okay? So at the very base level, if we're looking at racism, at the very base level of the individual mind, it's how our schema, and I'll talk about that in a second, how our schema is a filter system based on the data that we get. We categorize a lot of information. So on average, we get about 11 million bits of information per second, okay? A lot of information coming at us from our eyes, from our ears, from our mouth, or taste, smell, how we're sitting, how our clothes feel on our body, right? There's so much information coming at our brain. And then when we look at how much we process, it's usually between 40 to 60 bits per second, okay? 11 million bits of data to 40 to 60. So that's a huge amount of data reduction that's happening, right? From that psychological reduction of data is where the initial starting point of that unconscious bias happened. So we put things into buckets, right? If I see the color red, I put that into a bucket. If I'm in the romance mode, it could be roses and such. But if I see red in a political sense, well, that may be communism, or that may be blood or battles, right? Everybody has different connotations that puts into a certain bucket so that the brain can actually process what they're conscious of. Okay, now putting into that's the individual level, right? And then we expand that out into the team level and the organizational level. What happens? How do we make blunt assumptions about a certain child going through the system because we've seen this behavior, we assume that behavior represents the whole child, right? That's the systemic issue. does the system continue to make mistakes on that and generalize one single behavior to encapsulate the entire child's identity, encapsulate the child's outcomes and their ability to perform? Okay, that's the bigger system at play. Okay, good question, but in a nutshell, we can probably spend another whole hour talking about systemic racism and all the different systems that impact it, right? So like teachers, for example, the teachers have a learning system, they have a performance management system, right? How do those elements inform the teachers to help them move forward to minimize unconscious bias and make objective decisions, right? Those are systemic influences.
Okay, thanks for the explanation from the psychology perspective.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, as you said, we can discuss this later. There's a lot of things to discuss. We can move on.
Yeah, a lot of richness in this topic. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So now, just kind of building off of that a little bit. So when we look at the larger context of systemic racism, which, it's interesting that Alexis kind of saw the next slide without even seeing it. Everything starts with individual perceptions, right? At the very top of the cycle. How do we perceive reality? How do we perceive that human being in front of us? Do I see them as somebody with value, intrinsic value, or do I automatically put them into a category because of their education, because of their race and color and so forth, right? So individual perception happens first, and then individual thought process. How do we process that data that's coming in, right? How do we empower people? How do we take power away from them? How do we blame them? That's the thought process that goes behind everything, okay? And then, of course, the individual behaviors come out. This is what's visible down here, right? The behaviors, decisions. And then at some point, you make a judgment, okay? What do I do with this child? Should they be in the gifted program? Should they be held back? Do they have certain deficiencies that we can work on? Am I going to have a system to work on that, right? The judgment aspect comes into play. And then, of course, then it's the glass ceiling, right? How do I control? Is there a victim mentality? How far could the child go forward in the workplace? How far can you move forward in the workplace, right? So this creates a system, and it's a system is a cyclical piece that moves forward over and over again with some type of measurement and outcome. Okay, so when we look at systemic racism, system is not a group of people, but how we move forward, right? So this is the individual system side. When we look at the judgment side, we can easily expand this into the team element. We can easily expand that to the organizational side or even the societal side, right? So there's multiple systems layered on top of each other that makes this a lot more complex to explore. Okay, now, one very basic example here of a system is performance management. All of you work in some company at some point, and they all have performance management, right? In most companies, performance management don't work very well because it's a linear process. You go through annual reviews, whatever that is, it's not really necessarily indicative of the value that you provide to the organization. Okay, it's usually not a system in most places. Okay. When we look at the education system as a whole, education system is driven by funding at the state level or the federal level, right? And that comes back to standardized testing. And then standardized testing determines how well the schools get rated and how the funding happens. So the curriculum is controlled by the state. Okay, so when we look at CRT in Dublin City schools, as well as a lot of other school districts, the state curriculum drives the CRT, and the fact that there is no CRT in Dublin City schools at this point. Okay, that's the very simple element, and it's fascinating to see people trying to say, okay, there is not, arguing over it, but the state curriculum drives this. Okay, now there are individual applications of this that makes this a little bit more murky, right? A specific teacher can say, well, I want to inject this story into this curriculum or into this teaching outcome that I want, this lesson I want to teach, right? That's where it gets a little bit murky. Okay, so that's the system side of things. Okay? All right, any questions on this? Okay. All right. So, and from a schema perspective, a mental schema is how we categorize concepts or realities that come into our visual, come into our ears, come into our mouth, and so forth. So certain things, every one of us have a mental schema to help us reduce the amount of data we have. And also our identity informs of how we see things, right? Some people, they're always a victim. They're always complaining about somebody else, which disempowers them to do anything. That challenges, that creates an individual perception and a thought process that is always going to be limiting. as opposed to other people see things as opportunities. The worst days, it's an opportunity to learn something. So their perception of reality and the thought process is driven in very different ways. Okay, so identity becomes a huge aspect to this. Okay, so let's see, Nicholas has just made a comment here in the chat area about the standardized testing has no research showing that improves outcomes. Yeah, there's actually a really good TED Talk on this that looked at the system of education and what happened as the publishers for the Pearsons, the McGraw-Hills, as they saw the physical book market was going to diminish for them, they decided to get into the systems game where they can drive standardized testing, which drives the curriculum, which drives what they teach. So it's all encapsulated within a capitalistic system for the big companies to control as much as possible so they can drive their content and continue to be profitable. Okay. So there's another aspect to this which is fascinating. And one of the things as a psychologist, when I look at the challenges, the mental challenges of all the standardized testing, is that kids are having so much test anxiety getting introduced to them than before. So that's something that most people don't tend to look at.
May I real quick?
Yeah, sure, free.
Yeah, the standardized testing thing, it's not actually required. You can opt your students out. I've opted all. I have a senior, a freshman, and a third grader. And none of them, the only test they take is the MAP test because the teacher actually gets the results, within like a week or two. So it's it's actually a teaching tool. What do they call it? The air test now. It was the OAAs before that. They change it every 4 or 5 years. And when my kid was going to school and I saw that the testing booklet actually had instructions for what to do if a kid pukes on the test, I'm like, this might not be the best idea. So they've opted
right
out, and my senior is actually going to graduate with her associate's degree and her high school diploma at the same time. So the standardized test certainly, the lack of it hasn't hurt her, and that's one way that we can kind of push back against, systems and structures that are designed, not necessarily to help kids, but to help corporations.
Yep, exactly. And I wish everybody, all teachers across the board would have this level of courage and innovation to say, this is a game being played and I choose not to participate.
The teachers don't like it because their paycheck, So
yeah.
I've had teachers actually get smart with my kids over it because, my kids are going to score well, and that, hurts their, kind of their average, the testing score that they have. So, but, it's actually pretty psychologically traumatic for kids to have to do this 4 times a year.
Yeah, very much so. Couldn't agree more. So excellent. Well, thank you for your contribution, Nicholas. Okay, so moving forward. So one of the larger pieces in K through 12 as one of the key outcomes is identity development, right? Everybody wants to push people through the curriculum in order for them to choose a major when they go to college, to choose a specific life path. So the identity development is one of the key pieces that it's a contextual outcome of our education system. Okay. So when a student graduates, or even before they graduate, the questions of who am I? What's unique about me? And am I able to live that American dream, right? And the way we define that American dream is changing quite a bit. But at the core essence of that American dream is I can achieve better level of success than my parents did, right? Whatever the success is, determined by them, right? So when we inject various things, concepts into the education system, is it helping our students identify who they are and what capabilities they have as a unique contribution to society, to whatever life path they may choose, right? And this is something that kind of hit me in my face when I was talking to a bunch of, I think they're juniors and seniors, just Friday, talking to about college entrance essays that they had to write. I asked them, who are you? What's unique about you? And most of them couldn't tell me. Okay. I would love for our system to move to a state that the students have more clarity about who they are and what they can contribute in their life paths, right? And in our current environment with all the battle back and forth, what does it mean to be an American, right? Before it was a little bit clearer. Now there's clearly 2 sides and some people in the middle as well. So there's multiple sides. What does it mean to be a leader in our times? What does it mean to be a parent? How do I guide my children through these complex times and ages where we have a pandemic on top of all these social justice issues that's coming up? And what does it mean to be a student, right? All these questions could go back to the identity. Who am I? that's our job as educators, hopefully, to move the system forward so that students come out with a better understanding of who they are. When we look at this iceberg I model here, right? Your beliefs, your values, and your identity. These three pieces form everything that goes back to the perception side. Okay, we have to be able to do this right accordingly. Right now, leading this a little further, let's look at this from a psychological development perspective. Okay, this is standard 4 stages of cognitive development when we look at how the human brain develops over time. Now, while there are age numbers here, the age numbers are ballpark numbers. That's one of the challenges to the stages. Some kids develop faster and some kids develop slower, but these are just ballpark numbers from the age perspective. Okay, so when we look at this basis of cognitive development, the sensory motor stage, right? It's basically physical. Babies are trying to figure out, how do I grab that milk bottle and put it in my mouth to feed myself, right? They're holding people's hands. Every time you give a baby, they're grabbing your hands. It's just figuring out where my hands are, where my eyes are, how I can see, right? That's the first 2 years, okay? As we get them into 2 to 4 years, then the children is starting to have some type of a concrete thinking about what they need, right? This is their mind having a very egocentric perspective. It's always, I want this, I want that, right? My daughter's 3, and I'm trying to help her understand exactly how to communicate in a relational perspective, but she's always going back to, I'm hungry, I want water, I want this, I want that. It's always I, right? That's the egocentric side of things, okay? That's where they're at when they start entering kindergarten and in the first few years of elementary school. Okay? When we get to the concrete operational stage, typically from elementary all the way to the middle school side of things, the kids are starting to develop some type of inductive logic, right? And the basic logic, this is why we start teaching math sciences, where it's addition, subtraction, the basic logic gets implemented here. And children start to have some type of a unique thought process, okay? What is unique about me? Who am I? Those questions start to come up and they start to think about it and process that, okay? That happens at the concrete operational stage. Okay. At the formal operational stage, it's usually 12 years old and up, which is kind of when you mirror that to the high school system, right? Most of our high school students get into high school right around 12, 13 years old, where you start developing your deductive logic, okay? And then you're starting to see, here's a problem, here's different solutions, and how do I make choices on the different solutions that I have, okay? One of the major challenges here is emotional regulations. The human brain doesn't necessarily fully develop emotional regulation until we get to 18, 20 years old. It depends on the life experience and so forth, which is why you see kids have temper tantrums, right? Little kids have a lot of temper tantrums up in the early age. As you get older, you have less and less and less, right? It's the emotional regulation system, okay? Now, I'm gonna add to another dimension of development is systems thinking. How do we develop the human brain to see systems so that we can identify systemic issues and address them at the system level as opposed to blaming it on people, okay? In the deductive logic side, once you create that, you know, in the hiring side of it, we look at people that says, oh, I'm great at problem solving. And I ask them, if you're great at problem solving, what's the problem with that? Don't you always have to wait for a problem to happen, to blow up in your face? What about problem prevention? What about looking at the system, designing the system so that you eliminate the problem from happening, right? So we start looking at the system side of things, which is the next level of development for the human brain, okay? Now, when we look at these 5 stages, right? Where would you put CRT? How does it make sense from a development perspective? Where do you think it goes?
The fifth
I'm sorry, say that again, Alexis?
one, system thinking.
Yeah, it goes in the systems thinking side, right? So CRT is a tool for looking at systems, okay? So obviously it goes into later stages of development from a human brain perspective, okay? But when it comes to critical thinking, on the other hand, critical thinking can enter the child as early as when they start developing that inductive logic, right? When they have that unique thought, critical thinking can be introduced much earlier in the stages. Now, I was humbled to hear that actually Sarah provided me some wonderful examples of how some of the schools are starting to take system thinking early into the education system, which is wonderful. Okay, I'm going to dig that much deeper into that to learn more about it, because from a development perspective, it would be great for everybody to be able to think systems, so we stop fighting. Okay, That's the reality of it. Every time when you get to fighting, it's the fight, flight, freeze mentality. It's a very basic primal state of the human brain. Okay, system thinking gets us out of that. All right. All right. So that's the cognitive development perspective of where CRT can go. Okay. I'm going to pause for a second. Any questions?
Hey, Dr. Chen, this is Nan. Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you think teaching system thinking is a class or it's a method how we teach or the subject area?
Yeah, all of the above. So great question. So when it comes to systems thinking, I've looked at different universities, how they teach systems thinking in a semester. You can learn and understand the concept of system thinking, but you cannot think systemically. Okay. To be able to think systemically, you should be able to look at all the different interconnectivities of various aspects of the learning system, your home environment, right? If we talk about the home school situation with any child, how does the parent engage the child to learn? How does the school engage the child to learn? From a curriculum perspective, how does the teachers engage the child to learn? And how is everything connected? Parents connecting to the teachers. So in an inclusive model where the environment moves the child forward as opposed to, well, I send my kid to the school and it's the school's job to teach them how to learn, right? That wall between home life and school life shouldn't be there if you're looking at the system side. So to teach people how to think systemically, it takes a long time to develop. In my MBA program that I've designed, it's a 14-month program, and I walk them specifically through where is systems thinking in marketing, where is systems thinking in HR, where is systems thinking in operations, and we walk through each specific subject of the MBA curriculum, and we develop that thinking over time. And it definitely takes a year or more to develop systems thinking. And it also goes back to how we teach. And we're going to touch that on later on in this conversation. Great question, Nan. Thank you. Another context to kind of consider in the K through 12 education, identity versus identity diffusion. Okay, as we talked about earlier, having a child that understands who they are and what they are destined to become, and having that passion aligned with what they're going to study and moving forward is a huge benefit to the child. And it's something that we all want as parents, right? Having their child so that they don't have to change majors all the time. And it's really good financially too, because the minute you change majors in college, you have to take additional courses, and then the university life gets longer. But one of the major challenges in the CRT world is if we take CRT, inject it too early on into the life of the learner, right? We get into the problem of the psychology of choice. We have too many pathways and too many things, and they can't really understand exactly, and they don't make a choice at that point, which becomes a huge challenge. So psychology of choice, for example, in a very specific study, 24 flavors of ice cream in one store, 6 flavors of ice cream in another store, right? When we look at the buying rate, 3% buy with 24 flavors, 30% buy with 6 flavors, okay? So within the human brain, if we get too many choices, we don't make a decision, right? And that is extremely harmful to our children at that point. If we give them too many choices, it's hard for them to really grasp, okay, who am I? What is the right choice here, especially early on. At high school levels, this can be weaved into the curriculum to some extent, but at early age, it's going to be very challenging to give children too many choices in that, right? Which also hurts their self-esteem and so forth, okay? Now, another concept I want to talk about real quick is duality versus multiplicity, okay? Duality is the right and wrong, black and white. Multiplicity says there's many dimensions of reality, there's many truths, and how do we evaluate, assess multiple realities to come to a conclusion on our own, okay? In our K through 12 education, the practice of diversity is obviously one of the key pieces. This is where D&I kind of come into play. How do we make sure that we recognize every single child in its uniqueness from a development perspective? What does that individual child need to be successful? Every single child will see it differently, especially with the diversity that we have in the school district. There's so many different races, ethnicities, and colors and so forth, that the diversity really needs to be honored from a multiplicity perspective, not generic education to everybody else, right? Now, one of the key aspects to, if we apply inclusive education here, imagine the history class, okay? A history class, and I'm bring up the history because CRT tends to be brought up in the history light. So imagine a history class where the teacher may say, okay, let's study the timeline, let's say 1900 to 1920, right? Here's the main American historical view of that period. And now you, the student, what's your background? What's your interest? If you're Indian, go look at the Indian version of that timeline. If you're Pakistani, look at the Pakistani. If you're Chinese, if you're whatever race, color, background you have. If you're African American, go look at the slave version of that. Go look at the that African version of that. Whatever the timeline is, you bring that richness in so that the lesson is really about looking at the multiplicity of realities from different cultural perspectives, so that the teaching becomes so much more richer. And the teacher actually ends up learning a lot as well, because every single class will be different, right? You have different classes, different diversity, different viewpoints that gets to be brought in. And that's where you really make an empowerment perspective and help people develop that critical thinking. Okay, so that's one of the solutions pieces. And when we look at the historical aspect of how do we introduce multiplicity to help the child make wise choices based on critical thinking and multiple perspectives. Okay. All right, so moving on with our K through 12. In the Dublin School District, we have the profile of a graduate, right? So these are the profiles of a graduate. Think from the overall understanding, every single parent wants their child to graduate as an empowered individual, somebody who can make conscious decisions. They can critically think about different choices and make wise decisions that benefits themselves. Okay. One of the key challenges here is what's assessments, right? If we have these specific skill sets and characters and knowledge, how do we assess these kind of concepts, right? Well-rounded education, how do we assess that? Is that really about a standardized testing? Not really. If we can talk about well-rounded, it's more than the academics, right? It's their emotional availability, it's their mental well-being, it's their ability to be social and lead. When we look at creativity, innovation, there's ways to measure that. So, a lot of times when we look at whatever we want to inject into the education system, there has to be a set of metrics to help us learn and get better at it. So if we want to inject whatever theory it is, how does it fit into the development model? How does it enhance the identity building of that child? And what is the set of metrics that we put in place so that it helps us inform how do we make it better every single time? With every class of students we have, we should always get better and better and better. That's what a system is all about. Okay. Right now, we don't have a set of assessments that assesses the whole child and the well-rounded development of that child. Those are some things that we can easily explore into to get a better understanding of, okay, if I want to do critical thinking, or if I want to look at effective communication, how do we assess that? How do we get better at this education model overall over time as we move forward? Yeah. Just for a larger conversation here, if we look at CRT in higher education and beyond, right, in adult education world, this is the scaffolding that will need to happen. Okay, so let me introduce the term scaffolding for a second. Scaffolding basically said, if I want to teach you how to fly an airplane, first I need to teach you how to drive, and then you can learn how the wings work, and then you can learn how to fly an airplane, maybe on a simulator, and then you actually get on a real airplane and fly the airplane, right? And then, but you start with a single propeller, and then two propellers and jet and so on. There's a step-by-step process to develop something, okay? When we look at CRT, it's very complex, right? So in order to do this, first we have to have some level of mastery in critical thinking. How do we think about something so with an open mind, right? How much of an open mind do we have? How much humility do we have and self-awareness do we have? Those are some of the characteristics under critical thinking mastery. Once we've mastered that, then we can say, okay, now let's expand critical thinking into systems thinking, right? Get a better basic level of understanding. This is where a lot of university courses, a single course can develop at the university level to say, okay, now we understand systems thinking as a theory from a theoretical perspective, right? And now we go into identification of theories or systems, right? What are the systems in business? What are the systems in government? Okay. Now, when we look at a system in government, one of the obvious challenges is a 2 to 4 year term, right? And we always sometimes wonder, why don't politicians make decisions for the long term of good of the nation, good of the community, whatever the scale that is, right? But if you're trapped in a 2 to 4 year term, you have to worry about re-election. So the game is very limiting. The system puts people thinking short term. What do I need to do to get reelected? Okay. Long-term thinkers, they never survive in the system, right? That's the system of elections in a 4 to 2 year term. Okay, so when we look at government, that's one example of a system, and we can go on to all these different type of systems in business and government and in education as well. Right. So identification of system is one of the key skills. And then once you identify a system, what do we do to make it better? How do we enhance the system, right? And then we design new systems and implement the new system. Okay. Now, when we look at this scaffolding, a step-by-step process of integrating CRT into our thinking, where do you think CRT will go out of this scaffold?
3.
System thinking.
Yeah, so 3, okay. So identification of system, exactly. So CRT is about looking at the intersection between race and the legal system, right? So within the government, there's a lot of different legal systems, and then we can inject race in here. We can ingest, all different kinds of aspects of humanity, how we've evolved, and whether you want to call it oppression, control, manipulation. There's so many different societal examples of how various governments did it and throughout human history, right? So it's understanding the systems here. And then you start looking at, okay, now that I've identified it, how do I fix it? Right. So that's the higher education perspective of this. Okay. Now that's on the scaffolding side and designing the curriculum over a long-term period. Right.
Can I give a quick example of that here in Ohio?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
I was actually just talking about this in class today. In Ohio, we're over 80% urban in our, most people live in cities, about 6 or 7 cities. All the prisons are built in rural areas. When they transfer people to those prisons, they actually count the prison population as part of the county population for voter apportionment, which is a kind of a key component. So in Ohio, you're transferring people to Noble County, which has a population of 10,000, 12,000, a prison population of 3,000. So you're increasing the population size of that county by 20, 30%. And the prisoners can't vote, but the district gets more power because of it. See the same thing in Marysville, the same thing in Pickaway County. They always build them right outside of the urban centers so that they can kind of shift population in that way. And that's, one of the, a small portion of, kind of CRT and how it impacts the, government and electoral systems.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. And this game is being played all over the place, right? In business, everybody's working within a system of something, right? Whether it's how you get hired, how you get promoted, how your annual review works or not work, right? What kind of learning you have. There's a lot of systems being played. And the key here is if you have a mastery of understanding all 6 aspects of systems, then you can look at your life and say, I'm not trapped. I can go create my own. Why do I need to look at a specific system, right? Like a common one that I always love to joke with financial planners is, you're all here to talk about retirement. You have to plan your retirement. Retirement is a system. When was that created? Right? And they'll look at me like, what are you talking about? Like Industrial Revolution was when retirement was created, right? In that time frame, everybody worked with their labor, their muscles, right? That's why you have a retirement age of 60, 62-ish, because you physically can't continue to work. In our current world, we all work with our brains. How would retirement be restructured to work in a knowledge economy when we're working with our brain so that we don't have to be stuck in the office? And the pandemic has been amazing to show a lot of leaders, you don't have to manage people by time. Managing people by time was an old system from the Industrial Revolution because time was linear to output from a labor perspective. But when you're working with knowledge, there's no linear correlation, right? So people are starting to understand that, oh, I can manage people by their output, not by their time input, which gives you more freedom to choose when to work as long as your outputs can be sustained, right? So organizations are starting to figure this out, which is one of the wonderful outcomes of the pandemic, although there's a many negative side of it. That's one of the outcomes of the pandemic, getting out of the system of micromanaging people by time. So I'm sure we can go on and on about this, Nick. Thank you for your contribution. All right, so now, yeah, go ahead, Nick.
I was just saying you're welcome.
Yeah, okay. So when we look at the context of teaching, okay, how CRT or any complex theory can be taught has various requirements, okay? So first, philosophy of teaching, right? Many people in the education business still are stuck within the hierarchical model. I'm the teacher, I'm the professor, I'm the boss, sage on the stage, mentality, right? Versus a philosophy of teaching where, hey, we're here to learn together. My job as the teacher or the professor is to learn as much, if not more. Okay. Very different philosophies and very different views to go about looking at this, right? When we look at the specific skills you need in order to teach a complex topic like this, Socratic methods is obviously one of the key ones. How do you ask the right questions so people feel empowered and engaged in the conversation, as opposed to saying, here's a history, you're going to do the case analysis, write a paper exactly how I want you to do it, and my view is the only view, right? I'm sure we've all taken university classes or some other classes at various points where the teacher's view is the ultimate authority, okay? So giving people Socratic methods, giving them understanding of cultural intelligence, how do you work with different cultures, value the individuality, the different perspectives that different people bring in. Those are all key aspects to developing the key skills so that you can effectively teach a concept like this. Right? And the last point of this means some type of meaningful impact, right? As we talked about earlier, how much do our students remember? Okay, how much can we get them to remember? Can we increase retention as high as possible? It has to be some type of meaningful practice. Right? We can sit here and talk about all the wonderful theories. I can give you the world's greatest theory on solving, poverty, hunger, whatever the topic is, right? If we don't apply it, there's no meaningful practice. It's going to be gone and out of your mind. Okay. So at the end of the day, it's how do we get people to apply something that we've learned within the context of these complex topics, okay? Especially in systems thinking. How do we go about teaching it in such a way that it makes an impact, makes a difference? Okay, so people remember it. Because if you don't remember it, not much else can happen after that. All right. Okay, so with that in mind, I want to leave you with a couple of final thoughts on the different ways to kind of apply some of this concepts we've talked about. So I'm assuming most of you are parents or academics with students and so forth. Consider working with identity development a little bit. Okay, with your children, ask the questions. Who are you? With adults, you can do the same thing, usually more than once, to get them to reflect, who am I, over and over again, right? Have them do a dream collage. And this is something that can be done in 20, 30 minutes. Basically, get a bunch of magazines, right? Flip through them, okay? Whatever pictures call out to you, pull that picture out, okay? Later on, you can cut it, organize it into a big whiteboard, and then you have your dream chart, right? But before that, it's really understanding who do I want to be, or my vision of my future 10 years out from now, right? Something way out in the future. A vision chart is extremely powerful to pull the human spirit out of that individual to get them to see, wow, this is who I want to be, and use it to keep it in front of them so they know the endpoint of why they're working so hard to get there, right? All different activities for identity development. And then creating a timeline to get that accomplished, resources, you look at the different things here. It's very straightforward. You can always get the resources to do that. And then, of course, have an accountability structure. Who's going to make sure that you do it, right? We all have friends, teachers, family, and so on. Getting other people to hold us accountable is going to be one of the key aspects to applying what we're learning. All right. And then, of course, systems identification is something that all of us can kind of start practicing a little bit as well, looking at the system that we deal with. Well, if you have children, they're looking at college, universities, entrance into universities, or going into some technical field, there may be some type of entrance essay, right? What's the system in the entrance essay? Is it really about what you write, or is it really about how you write it and how you capture the attention, all the time you spend into it, right? As adults, you can look at the promotion system, you can look at retirement. There's so many different ways to look at a system, naming that game in life that somebody else has set for you. Look at the rules, look at the limitations, right? How does it limit your thinking, and how can you get outside of that rule, right? Not necessarily break the rules, but there's plenty of ways to redefine how you choose to live your life and the way you engage in it, okay? And of course, there's plenty of resources to look at, the finite game versus infinite game. That's another one of my favorite authors out there with Simon Sinek. You can kind of go explore. Okay, so some very practical things that you can do, hopefully, to better your lives and better the lives of your children as we move forward. Okay. All right, any questions on this? So I hope all this has been helpful for you to understand what CRT is and how, especially the context of how it can be developed within the human brain. and exactly what roles it has within the K through 12 education system. Again, in Dublin, officially, CRT is not taught in the curriculum, right? And from a values perspective, CRT definitely have value in certain contexts of education, but not necessarily in the K-12 system. Okay. All right.
Hey, Dr. Shen, this is Nan. I have some comments, right? I
Sure.
think the system thinking, that sounds wonderful. Looks like we can look at anything, right, deeply, and see the flaws in it or improve it. But system is also the way, I would say, either governing party or government used to govern, right? They create a system so they can in control. If you enable everybody to think this way, trying to change the system, would whoever in power have any incentive to encourage that? But basically, then they're losing control over the system which enabled them.
Yeah. So this becomes a wonderful philosophy of life to some extent. So a lot of people get into power and they constantly fight the fear of losing power. Now, let me give you another perspective. Okay. Order and chaos. There's a small select group of leaders who believe in the order and chaos, right? So if you let people go free, they will naturally create that specific order that you would want that has a natural organic outcome that is ideal for the group as a whole. Okay, so the amount of limitations that's driven into any society, any system is one way to approach it because they're coming from the fear and control factor. There's another empower factor that says every single individual has unique ideas to contribute to society. If I simply target them, focus them on innovations and solutions to address societal issues, everybody will focus on that, and the best outcomes of that knowledge base and that innovation will be able to move the country, move the city forward, right? So there's different approaches to this. Part of it is that when we look at the Industrial Revolution, management theories have been stuck in so many different generations of life that most people use management theories, which is very hierarchical. So it's up and down structure, and there's less and less mobility as you move up because there's less and less people that are in control, right? That's the management structure. But people often forget the management structure was created for task management, to manage tasks and processes. What if we create a knowledge structure that goes along with that, to move humanity forward from a knowledge perspective? So things that every company needs is innovation, right? How do we create a knowledge structure or innovation that everybody plays at the same game, at the same level? So there's no hierarchy, there's no color, there's no education background and so forth. Marketing doesn't make assumptions about engineering doesn't make assumptions about operation or sales. Everybody works at the same playing equal field within a web system that moves ideas forward, that builds ideas and innovations forward. Okay, so there are different ways to look at it from a systemics perspective, but most people tend to get trapped in the management mentality because it's always about a hierarchy and fear of losing control.
Okay, thank you. I think I sometimes think about, but also people in control have more power to either encourage or block the changes system, right?
Yep.
Then make that even harder to implement.
Yeah, exactly. But see, you're kind of also looking at it from the individual perspective, right? The person in charge have a duality perspective, block or create, right? But what if we took a system and gave that person in charge, gave the leaders at the top a new game to play? Okay, we gave them a new game to play that empowers them to move everything forward, and they can still be there, right? The hierarchy doesn't have to change, but the knowledge structure has to change. We introduce a knowledge structure to move them forward, which includes a learning structure on one side, as well as a performance management structure on the other side. Okay. So Nicholas has just added something on the chat area, so feel free to take a look at that. He's talking about the sociology perspective in conflict theory. Okay, any other questions? Nope.
Actually,
Okay.
I have another one. I'm sorry.
Sure, go
I
ahead,
to
Nan.
chat with you is what's the school's role in the child identity development, right? If school was created by Industrial Revolution to produce workers, right? And they're set up still this way, then can school achieve what we want, achieve the individual development, identity development at all, or it's parent role. Maybe we rely on too much on school.
Yeah.
Because the
So-
school is producing similar things. When you have individual development, it's individualized, diverse. You can't have one mode.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's conflicting with each other.
Right. So, the historical perspective of where the education system was created for and what is happening now, there's been a lot of changes in different elements of the school system, right? When we look at Dublin, the Emerald campus is one of the examples that they've kind of moved very far ahead in empowering students to choose their electives and get even a possibly associate degree by the time they graduate. So the children are giving much more of a choice. But from a system perspective, the identity development has to happen in multiple areas. Okay, it's just not teachers and it's just not parents. It's a collaboration between what the teachers are teaching in the context of their lessons, not the content of what they're teaching. So it's not the mathematics, it's not the social studies, but how they're teaching in concert with the parents and moving forward. So the child says, oh, I'm passionate about this. I want to learn more about this. This is who I am. This is who I want to be. This is going to be my supermodels or the heroes that I want to go after, right? It has to happen in concert with working together. One element is not necessarily going to change it. Neither systems will be effective until they start working together in a much more inclusive model.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Sure. All right, great conversations.
I have one more comment to make.
Sure.
I noticed your signature on your slides. You have Dr. Square. Now I understand why it's Dr. Square. It's not doctor plus doctor, it's Dr. Square, which is much more powerful than 1 plus 1.
Thank you.
So I think I'm totally with you about your conviction regarding if we should introduce CRT education in high school, right? Yeah, from your multiple perspective, you have demonstrated to us that CRT has very important value to develop people's identity and their system thinking. But this maybe it might be too complex or too early to introduce to high schoolers because their understanding of the government, the business, and other circumstances like a cumulative disadvantage, as the sociologist said, might be very limited. So it might be, it might not be a very good idea to throw it all towards them in high school. But I think, so the entire presentation you did is very valuable for a lot of parents, especially first generation Chinese parents, to understand what the true value CRT education or learning CRT is. I think it's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Todd, any comments? You've been quiet.
Hit the mute button. Actually, this has been very helpful for me to understand the theory itself and how the theory can be applied. Because one of the things that that I've been seeing is, and I'll just put a comment that a friend of mine said to me, is that it makes white people feel bad, so it's a bad thing to teach. And I wanted to really understand the more nuances of the approach and what it was designed to teach, and if it truly was a model worth utilizing. I teach leadership courses in nursing, And I've been a nurse leader for 30 years as a charge nurse, a manager, director, and administrator. And, you know, it's really hard to grow good leaders and teach them good skills, especially around all of these different concepts of growing teams and looking at teams and making sure that teams can critically think, teams can be diverse, teams can conflict manage. And I think this theory is something that I would like to maybe try to look about incorporating, especially your systems thinking approach in some of my courses. I teach an innovation course right now, and it's basic principles, but part of it is looking at systems and where there's opportunities to innovate. So I think there's some opportunity here for me to embed some of this into some of my classes.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Yeah. So, you know, one of the fun challenges in the university setting is I see a lot of people that have PhDs that are very knowledgeable about the content of what they're teaching, but how it's taught becomes a little bit more challenging. Right, practicing certain skills, and if we're really going to look at introducing aspects of systems thinking and CRT, the system of education will need to be adapted for that as well. So it's not just here's the paper, here's the assignment, and here's what we do, but make it more organic in such a way that we involve the students in designing of the paper, designing of the assignment, so they can have influence to a system that is very much initially set up to be a hierarchy.
And I'll push that one step higher. You know, we're trying to teach our leaders now, the managers of today and tomorrow, the directors and administrators of today and tomorrow, to be anti-racist, to look for these in the systems. And we really don't teach them how to do that. Yep. We just say, go out and be diverse and be inclusive and be anti-racist. And really 90% of them are of Caucasian, talking leadership, in the healthcare system, and many of them know only what they know from their own backgrounds. So there's no tool to help kind of broaden their horizons, and this may be one of those tools that could be utilized to help them look at systems, their own hiring practices, promotional practices, how they do their evaluations, how they hold their staff meetings, in order to be able to really truly try to get toward that goal. You know, I really appreciated the earlier comment about these diversity officers that are hired, and I'm just going to be blunt, fail miserably, is because I think they lack the tools to be able to actually be effective. You know, it's one thing to be a leader, and in healthcare we have a tendency to promote people who do a technical skill really well. So in nursing, if you're a great nurse, we make you a charge nurse, then we make you the head nurse, and then you become a director, but we don't teach you how to be a leader. And that takes a whole different skill set. And that's what I'm trying to do in my leadership courses. I'm teaching a doctoral leadership course right now, is I'm having them look at the theory, but our discussions center around practice. How do you incorporate that? What does it look like in real life? And I'm using case studies, and I'm using personal stories, and then having them tell stories, and then we're analyzing them. So I think this is really an important tool to start looking at changing some of the way that some of our leaders look at systems, and how can we make changes in systems.
Yep, exactly.
Is it really possible to change that structure when you have 90% of your leadership being white, though? I mean, part of the aspect of, you know, critical race theory is you have to have people at seats in the table. And in a nation that's 35% minority, when 90% of your leadership is white, it's almost impossible to be able to, you know, fully implement the ideas we're talking about here.
So that's back to where I think seminars like this that we can hold to continue to strengthen the toolkits of our leaders. I know that in my organization that we have set targets for diversity, and having not just diversity on the side of race, but also gender and sexual orientation, in order to, but it's about helping people get to that goal. What's the tool? What systems are in place that impede getting to that goal? Identifying it and making that change. I think it's more about ignorance on that level when it comes to some of our leaders. I personally know my organization, I think there's a real sense of urgency to make a change, because we want to reflect our patient population, and our patient population is not 90% white. And so I think there is this push to move in that direction. And I think this is the time to strike that iron. It's hot.
Yeah. And one of the key challenges here is that, you know, while it's great to have certain quota numbers, but do they know how to lead with diversity? Do they know how to lead in a systemic way so that people of various colors and races and so on all have an equal chance to thrive in this, right? And when I look at so many leadership training models and systems and so forth, most of them are still staying at the behaviors level. Everybody looks at the behavior. To be a good leader, you gotta listen more. Well, that's not a system, right? How do we create systems to empower people? And most people are not conscious of that creation yet. And with the conversation with inclusion right now is really wonderful, because when we look at inclusion, you know, I bring up meeting agendas as a very simple example that everybody does and everybody knows. Is there an inclusive system around that? And most of them, what do you mean? You know, it's always the manager, the project manager is creating that meeting agenda. Well, how do you create inclusion around that, right? And using inclusion as an example to look at knowledge structure, to look at innovation, and really bring out the diversity of thought that every single individual would have and how they move forward and contribute to innovation systems, right?
You know, you mentioned something earlier too, that the earlier leadership models were more task-oriented and how to accomplish the skill. And in nursing, we're moving more to relationship-based models and doing shared leadership, where groups come together to tackle an issue or to design an innovation or design a policy. And so we've actually moved away from the autocratic model and the laissez-faire model, and we've moved more to leadership exchange model and servant leadership model, transformational leadership model, in order to help give our students that relationship-based piece. We actually talk about emotional intelligence. And I think that's what's missing at times in our leaders of today, is they just don't know how, they just want to be the boss. They don't know how to be the leader, so to speak.
Yep, exactly. And this happened in every industry. So many industries, they promote the best technical guys and they don't give them training, right? When I was in the IT field or in the engineering field, everybody got promoted who was good programmers or who good mechanical engineers, and nobody looked at, do they really want to manage people, and how do we develop these people to think systemically from a process systems perspective, as opposed to go be a leader, I'm going to pay you more, good luck. Right. So Sarah, you've raised your hand. Thought?
I just wanted to thank you. I think in this current context, one thing that really excites me about what you've shared is that I think there's definite room for common ground. I believe that, explicitly teaching skills associated with critical thinking and systems thinking to our children across our system is something that we can all rally around. We can all believe in, we can all support. It can bring our community together. So I just love how you took this topic that has created division and is somewhat controversial. And in that topic, you found, you've elevated and explained, something that is so important for our students. I think you've also brought us back to the reason why we're having this conversation. It's about our students and what can we do for children. And so that's, this is something that I really believe in. I think it's so important. So thanks for the way in which you teed this up. I thought it was wonderful.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Okay, there's no other comments. We'll go ahead and end this. Nicholas, if you want to stick around, we can continue to talk if you like. I saw your comment in there, or anybody else want to stick around. I'm very accessible. You can easily reach me. drtedsung@gmail.com. I'll put that in the chat area if you wanted to reach me to have further conversations about this. I think there's many, many ways we can apply some of these concepts to move our families as well as our companies, organization to move forward. Okay, all right. Thank you, everyone.